everyone. Today we're going to discuss about climate smart PPP, public-private partnerships. World Talent Economy Forum, we are working with public-private partnership authorities of the government agency of Bangladesh, India, and different South Asian government. And beside that, we are developing economic zone. So that's why public-private partnership is a very important issues for developing nations. Besides that, climate change is one of the important aspects. Country like Bangladesh, India, Maldives, uh, Indonesia, these are the countries they are heavily impacted by the climate change. So we need better policy, we need better strategy. We have our world famous speaker, Mr. David Schumacher from Transhumanist Party. Transhumanist Party actually offer different kind of policy for, I want to say, techno policy for human progressions. Beside that, Professor David Smith, he has diversified knowledge. We have other speaker. They committed to us. They will join these sessions. We will specifically utilize it for developing better policy with different think tanks in Asia Pacific. Mr. David Schumacher, what you want to add for today's session, especially when we discuss about public-private partnership? What is the view? How we can improve and why? How we can take climate smart initiative?
Yeah, all very good points to discuss, Dr. Sharif. Public-private partnership is a word that I see a lot in print these days. But I always like to define terms, and I'll do that here as well. So for those that have heard it, but maybe haven't looked up a tighter definition for it, the definition that I see that I like the best is it's a contract between government and a private firm or firms, and it's targeted towards financing, designing, implementing, and operating, in many cases, infrastructure facilities and or services that were normally provided or traditionally provided by the public sector. So what has that got to do with uh, being climate smart? And that's what I want to talk a little bit about as we go. I think uh, public-private partnership is exactly what we do need to be uh, climate smart, especially in two areas. One has to do with climate financing, getting the money that it takes for the projects to be able to reduce our carbon footprint to get nearer to zero. And also, we can't forget about uh, climate smart, I think, also is mitigating the effects of climate change that we have already experienced. And as we go to zero, we're going to experience more. And we need to be able to look at that too. So public-private partnership is going to help specifically, I think, with finance. And then an area that I'm very interested in, which is innovation. Sharif mentioned that I'm with the Transhumanist Party and I'm director of applied innovation there. So I tend to look at things through that lens. So why do we need this public-private partnership? Why can't just public agencies, the governments, do this for themselves? Well, first off, I'd say that they have a track record that shows that they're not able to do that. We've had a lot of talk about climate, and if we're going to be climate smart, we need to turn that talk into verifiable results. The government's very good at identifying, I think, and looking out for the needs of the people that they serve, but maybe being quick to market, being able to use adaptive financing, maybe not so good. Maybe innovation works a little better in the private sector. I've been in both government and worked in private companies, and that's been my experience, is that the private companies are open to being able to move faster. So why is that also a problem? Well, because climate change is a constantly moving target. This means that we need to be flexible and adaptable. Government doesn't have a good track record for doing that, and some very large corporations, frankly, don't either. But there are elements in the business world that can do that, that can be disruptive, if you will, that can bring innovative entrepreneurial ideas. So this blend between the public and the private can be very helpful. Now, I mentioned finance. If it's a government only project, then who's paying for this? It's the taxpayers. Okay. Now the taxpayers get benefit for that, but that's quite a load on, I think, the tax base in any nation, locality, whatever. By bringing in private aspects to this, we open up private capital and private financing if the contracts are written properly. And that can also help with speed to market and being flexible and adaptable, as many companies find that they have to be in this era of changing technology, changing markets, and changing geopolitical situations. So we need to be flexible and we need to be adaptable for those reasons if we're going to work towards maintaining energy security and reducing carbon footprint at the same time. I mentioned back in finance, and I'll touch on that for just one more minute. That doesn't mean that there won't be any government funds involved. Once again, this goes back to that contractual relationship I talked about at the beginning. But climate projects can be very risky. Will it get if a company does this on its own, will it get government approval? Will it have approval from the masses? Well, if they invest a large sum of money and the goal changes or public sentiment changes or government regulation changes, those private businesses are at risk. So at a public-private partnership, the government can supplement with money, maybe make loans themselves, or make guarantees to companies that are developing technologies to help us be climate smart. So this is another way that finance between public and private can work together. And I already spoke about a little bit about how innovation can work better just by broadly saying that I think that innovation works faster and is more receptive in many private businesses. And there are examples of that in not just areas of climate change, but in other areas. I think, for example, NASA's relationship with Boeing and SpaceX is a good example. In the past, that would have been an entirely NASA project, Artemis, to go to the moon and beyond. Instead, NASA manages the project, they maintain ownership of the project, but they put out bids and they then select vendors for various parts of the programs. And in some areas, I think, and it's proven to be very wise, they've accepted two vendors to cover the same area. Like in the initial spacecraft that showed us Boeing spacecraft and SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft. And Boeing ran into problems, but the project didn't slow down because SpaceX was able to continue, and now Boeing's back into the program. So there's a lot of flexibility, as well as the other things that I talked about here. So these very large-scale projects that have been traditionally government-centric, I think, are very good for public-private partnerships. And I think being climate smart definitely falls into that category. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there's still a place for small business being climate smart. And that can still be a form of public-private partnership, but maybe engineered differently, maybe more at a departmental or regional level or at an operating level. Or what I like the best is to see independent entrepreneurs that come in with disruptive technologies that accelerate, and we do need to accelerate that accelerate our movement in the goals that we want to maintain. So, being climate smart, public private partnerships can do that. It's not a guarantee. The contracts need to be written properly, administered properly, rewarded properly, and maintain the public approval, which comes down then to a political situation that we can talk about later or not. Anyway, those are my opening comments, Dr. Sharif.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, what you want to add for today's session, especially if we have better climate smart technology for integrating public-private partnerships, you can share for our audience.
Sharif, thank you so much. I'm very fortunate to have been involved with public-private partnerships for decades. A company that I helped found and was CEO here in Austin, we actually produced the first public-private partnership software designed explicitly for them. And they were used to build across the United States many toll roads where it was a public-private partnership with funding actually coming from overseas for most of those, but where the commercial sector, a different funding source, and the government came together to create these roads where there was not money to do it. And those are some prime examples of how public-private partnerships get started. And you talked a little bit, David, about some of the mechanics of it. One of the big things we saw with public-private partnerships is you have to share documents, you have to share information, but you also have to protect some of your information, but have it there where it can be audited at different times to be there so that you know the public-private partnerships are doing good business practices and others like that, which have been a challenge with many of the public-private partnerships around the world. If you look today, the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with very carbon intensive infrastructure, construction, operation, and particularly in public transportation, energy, water supply, sanitation, others. And we know that in each of these areas, to meet the targets which have come out of the UN actions and others, during the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to need to build new and rehabilitate much of the aging infrastructure to meet the increasing global demand, the emerging economies. And if I look in the developing countries, they account for roughly 2/3 of the global infrastructure investment that's needed. And that's a lot of money when you begin to look at it. But many risks associated with climate change will be felt the hardest by many of the low-income countries, and their ability to prevent and respond to the impacts of climate change are limited. That's why at this recent COP27, there was so much interest and focus put on that one. And, public and private investment expertise, particularly including infrastructure financing public-private partnerships or P3s, are essential for us to look at this delivery of, let me call it climate smart infrastructure, because it's not just replacing what was there before, it's replacing it with more of a smart infrastructure that can respond to the demands of climate change, that prevent new ways to do things that our old infrastructure couldn't do it, and bring new innovation to bear and new capital to bear. So if you look at the needs of innovation, both in terms of technology solutions and actually the funding sources themselves available under P3s, it really is a useful framework for which the public and private sectors can pool and coordinate their finances, their technology resources, their ability to use regulatory actions on land and other things like that. And we know that as I look at climate change, it is a morphing, that is an always changing type of target. You begin to do stuff in one area, and then it will create changes in other areas that you have to go and handle and do things. And I think we see some great examples already. We look at the country where Dr. Talib is, and there's some great examples of public-private partnerships in Jordan that were really put in place to look at things like water scarcity, the raising temperatures there, and others. And they looked at how to pull the public, the private, and the civil society actors to put in place there. So there is in Jordan a public-private partnership of put together to begin to look at how to achieve climate compatible growth through enhanced fiscal and structural reforms that support the low emission resilient investments uh, that really support a document that was put together called the Jordanian National Climate Change Policy 2022-2050. And the government there is looking at how to build a smart city blueprint for a greener future and begin to implement this with public-private partnerships. Now, if I look in parts of Africa, we see the same type of emphasis of putting plans in place and pulling together public-private partnerships to do it with expertise pulled from all around the world. Uh, we're seeing this in most parts of the world today as we're going forward. But to answer your other question, Dr. Sharif, very oftentimes, particularly developing nation governments, have a hard time both finding very advanced technology, uh, acquiring it, and then implementing it, because much of the advanced technology required to deal with climate change is very complex, a lot of sensors, a lot of different ways to remediate, and has to require a very skilled workforce and to being able to use it. Part of some of the public-private partnerships I've been involved with and helped set up, we actually allocate some money out of the public-private partnerships with just what I'm talking about, workforce development. The education is very important here again, because the ability to pull public-private partnerships together to mingle funds, but more importantly, the resources and the regulatory impacts and the capabilities are very important as how we try to be climate smart today in these public-private partnerships. And building that educated workforce, building public awareness of the impact of climate smart decisions, of climate smart cities, and climate smart technologies is not a small undertaking. And providing those funds as part of a public private partnership agreement is one that I've seen as best practices time and time in some of the larger infrastructure projects I've seen undertaken as public private partnerships. There's a lot more on this, but I can keep going. But let me stop here for a moment and let Dr. Talib talk for a little bit.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David.
Dr. Talib, I have an interesting news for you and
Yes.
for our speakers. I want to share because we are working with developed nations to solving complex problem of developing nations. I'm just sharing uh, one one of the world most crowded cities bus mass transit railway.
Which is where?
So this is first time. Dhaka ensures this transit, uh, this trains and all of the new facilities for their communities. Specifically, when we discuss about public-private partnership, that time political role become very, very important. What do you think? How do you think about political role of Bangladesh and how it, it can be impactful for global politics?
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharif. I listened very carefully to Dr. Schumacher, Dr. Smith also. And the thing is, I'm not sure that this public-private partnership can be the same thing in the developing world than it is in the developed world. It's different here. Governments have to take the lead here. I mean, governments have to take the lead in anything that they need to do, and especially when it comes to climate change. Climate change is a governmental endeavor. That's how we see it. That's how people in the streets see it. Because people in the streets are not very concerned about climate change now, unfortunately. They're busy in doing other things. They're busy with their lives. They're busy with their food, with their employment, with the future that they have. And climate change is something that is looked at in our part of the world as something that is the making of the developed world. And it's the developed world responsibility to do that. It doesn't mean that we will be affected by climate change. We are already affected by climate change here in Jordan and in many parts of the developing world. Actually, in Jordan here, which is part of the Eastern Mediterranean, I was attending a conference in Cyprus a few months ago, and I was told there that it's a hot spot for climate change. East Mediterranean is one of the hottest spots. Well, I didn't feel that, and that's what I said to the conference people. I didn't feel that anybody in the streets would bother much about it. So when we talk about public-private partnership here in this part of the world, we have to imagine that this can only happen if the government takes the lead in this. Because even if there is enough credible public-private partnership and private partnership in this, it's not as effective as it is in the developed world. That's unfortunately a case. Now, I was listening very carefully to what Mr. Schumacher said and then Mr. Smith after that. And I think one of the best ways of doing this is for the governments to allow for some kind of tax breaks and incentives for the private sector to do something like that. That's what people expect out of government. Governments must give some tax cuts and tax incentives to private companies that deal with climate change. Without that, the private sector would not move anywhere in this because there is no public pressure here in this part of the world. That's what I wanted to say for now, and I keep the rest for later. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharif. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Talib, I just want to share because I closely work with public-private partnership departments. Like country like Bangladesh, we allow, let's say, we allow for individual power producer uh, for uh, solar energy, and it can be public-private. On the other hands, there are very good model in between Malaysia and Bangladesh. They successfully done these gel mill projects. This is also a very successful things. Government actually manage, monitors, share necessary resource and policy for this project, but private corporation they finish these things. So maybe this is one of the good model for developing nations. Maybe developed nations can engage more with this process. On the other hand, we can create better policy. That is the way actually World Talent Economy Forum working right now. What is your advice? We can improve more.
Yes. I think what Bangladesh is doing is very important. But the fact remains that even in Bangladesh, if government does not sponsor this, if government does not look as if it's the godfather of this, it would not work. It would not work. The private sector wouldn't come in. And that's why I'm suggesting that governments must make some incentives for the private sector to do that. Without that, the partnership would not work, actually, because the cause is not a very pressing case for the public-private partnership to get into. And what's happening in Bangladesh is very interesting because it's cooperating with another developing country, which is Malaysia, to actually deal with the issue of much of the crowdness in the cities, Cities emit now 80% of the carbon footprint of the world. Cities are very, very important in this regard. And cities are getting bigger and bigger, especially in the developing world, because people are moving from countrysides, from villages to cities, to seek better life and better opportunities there. So we can't expect the private sector in developing world and the governments in developing world to carry more of the share than they are carrying now. Unfortunately, it's affecting all of us, but this is not what is prevalent in the streets. I mean, I'm going to be very honest with you about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Talib. Mr. David Schumacher, you are from developed world, you are representing a political party, and how we can develop better collaborations, partnerships, and create better policy for doing this kind of project.
Well, that's a very important question. And I'll come at it from two different directions. One, there is the first one, which I think may be the most important, I'm not sure, is understanding. So to what Dr. Talib and you, Dr. Sharif, were saying about how you see public-private partnership, I think is very close to what I was saying. For example, let me be clear. In a public-private partnership, the way I understand it, government maintains the overall responsibility for the project. And then in the contract, that can be spelled out in as much detail and at depth in the organization as is necessary to achieve the results that you want. I'm not talking about privatization, which I see differently, which is the government just hands something to a private corporation and say, run that. We've actually, here in my area of the United States, have had some very bad results.
Where are you living? Where are you living, Mr. Schumacher?
I'm in
Where
Arizona. I'm in the state of Arizona.
Good.
Uh-huh.
Good.
So we have a lot of sunshine and warm days like you do as well.
Yeah, we do. We have that too.
We have that in common.
Yeah, good.
So, and by the way, I agree with you that government needs to take the lead. That's the reason I'm talking about responsibility. Yeah. This needs to be a government-defined project. And the reason I think it needs to be government-defined matches, in some respects, some of the things that I heard both you and Dr. Sharif say. But it also needs to be that way to make sure that as many people as possible get results from this, that it doesn't become too narrow of a solution.
Yeah.
And that goes to the second part, which is understanding across national borders. So before we started the show today, I was telling Dr. Sharif that I really like hearing viewpoints from different portions of the world because it makes me get in and try to read and understand more. I was reading an article by the vice president of the energy unit for, and forgive me if I don't pronounce this correct, but it's Mashreq Bank, which I believe serves your area.
Yes, Mashreq Bank. Yes.
And they were making a lot of these same, it was a very enlightening article. They were making a lot of these same points that we've talked about here this morning about it can't be privatization. It needs to be a true public-private partnership with government taking the lead and government doing what it does best and the private sector doing what it does best. So I think those are the main things to help in all different areas of the world, is to have the world talking together and being able to see where we're the same and being able to see where we're different. And the governments in all the different areas being able to direct what needs to be done for their area, keeping in mind that this is a global problem, but it's going to work out differently in Alaska than in Jordan, for example. Yeah. So we need to have that local policy We need governments overall to come together to make sure that we're working. Because if Arizona solves the problem for Arizona, that's not really going to happen, because it's like being in a swimming pool. The water circulates. So if you got bad water in other parts of the pool, it's eventually going to flow back into your area. We all have to work together in this. And maybe that'll be a good byproduct from working through the challenges that we have with climate change. So I hope that adds a little clarity.
May I ask a question, Mr. Schumacher?
Absolutely.
How about the suggestion that I made that the government make tax breaks and give incentives to private sector?
I absolutely agree. And I would even go beyond that. I would say that besides the tax breaks, that to take the uncertainty out of some of these projects. For example, from the transhumanist science and technology point of view, I look at science and technology solutions to climate change. So maybe there's a solution for a light sail or something to make artificial clouds to help us reflect back more of the sun's energy. I'm just using that as an example.
Yeah.
Please don't take that on its merits, but I'm just saying something speculative like that. We need government to be able to step in and incentivize private business to take the risk of going out, getting capital, building plants, employing people, operating the solution. Because if the risk is too high, the private sector will sit out. The government, as you rightly say, needs to take that lead.
Yeah.
And sometimes we'll get it wrong, and the government will pay the cost and reimburse maybe a private company for doing something that sounded good. But on the other hand, if we don't do that, we'll never get some of those more speculative solutions to market that will do good for all of us.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. David Schumacher, World Talent Economy Forum, beside this dialogue, we are developing a lot of projects. We really want to welcome transhumanist parties to join in our ecosystems. Most of the cases, the developed world, especially research, innovations, less action, more talk, more futuristic views. We want to save our life. We want to make our present more peaceful and beautiful. That's why we want to welcome all of you to join in our action.
And you're right. This is political as well, if I can interrupt, which is why we are a political party, a small, minor party trying to influence the conversation. Where the real help comes from, I think, is from the members of any party and our party as well. So them listening to shows like this because I promote this, or you coming on our enlightenment salons and talking about these things, will bring people that maybe we don't even know what their talents are out that will be able to help.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor David Smith, what do you want to add? Many interesting discussion today.
And we've had many interesting discussions over the last several months, and this is surely one of them. I would say a couple of things. Dr. Lee, David, you're both correct in that the government has very special things they can do to help encourage the type of investment that public-private partnerships bring, the type of expertise that public-private partnerships that can put together that are really hard to do by any one factor by themselves, which is some of the reasons you form public-private partnerships. So it's just like companies and academia and others coming together to do joint development contracts. The same is what you see with public-private partnerships. A good example on the ones that I mentioned at the top of the show was that we had to have the state part of their public-private partnership deal with what we call here right-of-way access, and where it's hard for a private company to go buy land from citizens, to go, and particularly if they don't want to sell it, execute something called public eminent domain, where the government can come in and say, we need this for this project. We're going to give you a fair market value for that.
Yeah.
Private companies can't do that. That's solely a governmental function. So you have to understand those. I like to, in the public-private partnerships I've put together, if possible, it's not always possible, I love to include academic components. I include small business components in where we can encourage small entrepreneurs and small businesses to be able to be part of the team that works on public-private partnerships. And it's very important to be able to do those. I also try, as we look at public-private partnerships, to look at what are the appropriate metrics, what are the appropriate key performance indicators, the KPIs, that you can judge from all the parties going forward of how effective it is. And many different ones. You know, you see like the ones which Dr. Sharif has up right now, uh, really great examples of it, of a public-private partnership capabilities going forward. Uh, I've looked at others around the world. Uh, I have looked at in the African continent, public-private partnerships being put together to not just do infrastructure projects, but for example, to build a medical school in a country where there was not a medical school before. And you see public-private partnerships coming together to do things like that. And I was fortunate to actually have been involved in that one as an advisor and see how that has become life-changing for that particular nation, uh, in that they're getting their own resources there for their own healthcare support. But they could not have done it with just the government. The private sector could not have done it because of the other rules there, and rules had to change. You had to have the two of them coming together to be able to have the funding to make that one happen. And of course, it is a massive infrastructure project in reality, building it, but also hiring the people to be the teachers, hiring the other people, and helping make sure that when people graduated from it, they were going to be employed in country as opposed to leave the country. So these are also the types of things you see when you construct public-private partnerships. You know, we were talking about climate smart public-private partnerships. This is one of the more recent kinds, but we have fantastic examples of public-private partnerships going back in many different areas. For us to be reactive, and not just reactive, we have to get ahead of some of the climate change issues. And a multi-way public-private partnership, not in a company, but the government, maybe multiple companies, maybe academic institutions, uh, and maybe even regulatory groups of countries around the country can form public-private partnerships where you can deal with particularly climate smart activities on a wider range. Many people who've listened to this broadcast have heard me say before, if I just change the climate that's around me, I'm not going to have much impact. I've got to change the climate in the region and then globally to have an impact against climate change. And that's one of the reasons that public-private partnerships are also interesting, in that they can be multi-country, multinational public-private partnerships as well. Yes, they're more complex. They tend to be bigger uh, groups of people participating in it, but the potential for impact is much greater than just trying to do small things, even self-funded activities on a more limited basis. So, Dr. Sharif, I think that answers your question, I hope.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Tani.
Dr. Smith. Thank you,
Yes.
Dr. Smith. Now, in order to be able to carry this conversation through, we have to define public-private partnership in a better way. Public-private partnership is not an equal partnership. It's a partnership that is led by government, as we said, especially in the developing world. It is like that. And if government don't adopt this thing, after all, governments are responsible for education, for example. That's an example that we need to always remember. Education is very important in climate change, but it's also important in other matters of life. So public-private partnership is a partnership where the public sector comes in as leader of this group, and the private sector comes in as a supplement to this group. That's the fact in our part of the world, at least, because governments take a responsibility in most of the things, Dr. Smith. I mean, governments are seen as the owners of the place. As you said, if a certain area needs to be adopted, if certain piece of land needs to be confiscated, government has the right to do that. Private sector cannot do that. You know that. So we have lots of these examples here. But I think that we need to understand the structure and the nature of the private partnership in our part of the world. In the developing countries, it's different from that of the developed countries. Because in the developed countries, the private sector has its own life and its own entity and its own structure, so to speak. In the developing countries, private sector is weaker because the government's form is different from that of the developing country. In the developed countries, it's much different from that, unfortunately. Now, I want to talk about climate change a little bit also. Climate change is very important to all of us, and it cannot be solved by each country on its own. That's for sure. Just like COVID could not be dealt with in each country of its own. Climate change and COVID are the same nature in that they don't recognize national borders. You know, what's happening in our part of the world can happen in Jordan, in Israel, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Saudi Arabia. It's the same thing. So we need to come together, and the governments must come together. That's very important, because they are the ones that can set the rules, at least for any private partner. Besides the fact that this would encourage the private sector to start working regionally, which is very important for us. They don't work regionally now. And I think if governments come to an agreement that they should give incentives to these private sectors that deal with climate change, like they do with other things, that would be a very good start for the cooperation, I think. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Sharif.
Dr. Talib, I have one of the interesting questions because we are representing youth communities, we are representing the talent people. When we're discussing about this public-private partnership and we are discussing about the role of the government, how government become more transparent or people get more trust on government because at present situation, this is the lackings around the
Yeah,
world. So
yeah.
how the government can overcome from this situation?
This is a political question. The lack of trust between governments and the public is growing in the world of today, and especially in the developing world. It's growing too much. I mean, we don't have trust between the people and their governments. This is a very important question. But the thing is that this is a political issue. I think governments must descend from their plateau that they're in and come down and talk to the people and listen to what they have to say. It's a political issue, as I said. It's not something that we can discuss in this very scientific forum now. But it's something that the developing world is suffering from much more than the developed world, unfortunately. Thank you.
Dr. Talib, I have another question for you. When we observing UK have three different prime minister in short period of time, on the
Yeah,
other hand, USA also is struggling when the last time Biden administration come.
yeah.
There is a big clash in between Biden administrations and Donald Trump. What do you think? It's only the problem of developing nations, or it's
No, no, no.
actually happening around the world, also
It
in
is
developed
happening.
world?
It is happening around the world. But what you're mentioning here is one of the characteristics of the developed countries, because the change in governments in the developed countries depends on many things, and they stick to the rules and regulations of the country, the constitutions of the country. So that's something that we should respect, and they respect very much. But the fact is that this disrupts the public policies. It disrupts many of the things that we're working on, like climate change, for example. The previous administration in the United States administration of Donald Trump did not believe that climate change is the real thing to start with. But now it's different. So we can't just in the developing world wait to see the results of what the developed world is coming through, so that we wait for that and wait what the reaction would be from a government of the United States or the government of the UK. I don't think we can do that. Now, politically, I must say something else here, that the developing world is not ready to see that the rules of the developed world should be applied on it. Unfortunately, it's a fact. Now, what does that mean? It's a political statement I'm saying here, is that the developing world is becoming very sensitive towards imposing on us your systems of life, your values, your way of living, so to speak. And that includes the formation of governments and including everything in that. I think that's the case. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent discussion. I have more questions for you, but I have to discuss with Mr. David Schumacher. Mr. David Schumacher, very interesting discussions when we discuss about public-private partnerships. We are discussing about the model of democracy. What's your thought?
It definitely is political.
Yeah,
There are
very.
there are elements in the transhumanist movement that don't think transhumanism should be involved in politics. Obviously, I have a different point of view being in the transhumanist party
Yeah.
because technical solutions won't work all by themselves. You need
That's very true.
adoption, you need acceptance, you need people to understand why we are proposing the solutions that we are.
Need education.
Education, and it goes back to trust as well.
Yeah.
And trust is something that can be very easily lost, and it can be time consuming, even difficult to obtain. But track record, I think, is probably the biggest issue with developing trust. Without the proper, without people seeing that, gee, this what you're proposing is scary because it's new and we humans just don't like things that change. If we can point back to something else that was scary and show how we navigated our way through the difficulties that were there, and there'll always be difficulties, then that can help build the trust that we need. And that's part of the political discussion. But other parts of the political discussion is sticking to the rules like Dr. Talib talked about. I mentioned that I'm here in the state of Arizona. So I'll talk about Arizona for just a second. Obviously, part of the United States, and we suffered through the election denial claims and so forth after our last national presidential election. We're going through the same things here with the recent election for the governor of Arizona. And the losing party used the same playbook that was used on the national level.
Yeah.
I think realizing that they probably can't succeed in overturning the election, which they would like to do, but they can sow seeds of doubt and mistrust, which may help them in their minds as they move forward. So we have active agents in Arizona and the United States, and it is pointed out around the world that will try to take advantage and diminish trust. And this is a very sensitive time for us as we're up against many issues that do require trust. So that means it's more important than ever to stick to the rules, to show when we make good decisions and when we make bad decisions, and to correct those. And that goes to transparency, which also helps with trust. But it's back to track record. We need to do that over and over. Part of that track record is also realizing that when we have a good, acceptable solution, that solution may not work everywhere. just because it works in Arizona doesn't mean it'll work in Alaska,
Yeah.
doesn't mean it'll work in Jordan, doesn't
That's
mean it'll
right.
work in Texas. But maybe an approach from that might, maybe a local approach from that might, or something else. So we need to be respectful that just because what we've got here is the latest and greatest thing for us, it's not necessarily the case elsewhere. And the reverse of this is also really true. Let's say, hypothetically, that there is a good climate smart solution that Jordan adopts, pioneers, but in the long run, it's less than successful. That doesn't mean to ignore what Jordan came up with, because even though it might have been less than successful in Jordan, it might work in France, or it might work in Germany, or it might work in South America someplace. We need to, that goes back to transparency. That's why we need to learn not only from our successes, but we need to learn from things that are something less than success. And that will all make us smarter. And guess what? That keeps us talking to each other. And that also helps to build the trust factor. So those are some of my thoughts on the subject.
Thank you. Professor David Smith.
Sharif, thank you. A lot of wisdom being spoken today, and a lot of insights and best practices coming and being put on the table. What is very enlightening to me is when I've looked at public-private partnerships around the world and looked at the technology projects accompanying many of them. I actually find some of the work being done in the developing countries surpasses the innovation we have in the developed countries, because you see more creativity being brought to bear on how to solve the problem. You often find that there's a higher level of commitment to the projects because of the importance in the nation. We were doing a project in Haiti, the poorest nation in this hemisphere. And in other parts of the world, there's resistance sometimes to putting a biomass plant in. A biomass plant converts material from one form to another. It will take waste from fields and from restaurants and other things like that and put them in from agriculture and put them in a plant, convert it to heat, convert it to power, convert it to fertilizer, convert it to other materials that can be used for other things. Well, I can tell you, if I were to put a biomass plant in Austin, it wouldn't get built, because they do not want that type of plant here. But in a developing nation, that solves so many problems. It put paying jobs in place for people where there were not jobs before. It created a whole ecosystem of buying the biomass to bring it to the plants for conversion that wasn't there before. The fertilizer regenerated land that had been barren for a while. So you can see how that type of an innovative public-private partnership can have a tremendous impact in a developing nation that it would not have had the same acceptance or the innovation required in a developed nation like you're in Texas. So there's some real advantages for that. But I would like to kind of conclude this with a couple of really more pointed comments. Dr. Tlaib, 1,000% correct. The government has a key role. And particularly in developing nations, many times the government is the instigator. I also want to say, though, that sometimes NGOs tend to be the lead and the instigator. When I've looked at what USAID has done, I look at what the International Business Development Bank has done, when I look at what the World Bank has done and others, is they've brought together funds to enable the public sector and the private sector to work together. I have seen NGOs also have a leadership role in bringing this together. I've also seen industry who have identified needs that are beyond the scope of an industry, particularly on large infrastructure projects, reach out to the government, reach out to other funding bodies and things, and have pulled together the public-private partnership. And yes, the government has its own role, industry has its own role, NGOs, funding organizations have their own role, and once again, academia has their own role. Particularly in developing nations, oftentimes the expertise is not there from the human capital, from the workforce, to make these types of projects sustainable. So education, as I said before, has to be a key component of pulling together many of the successful public-private partnerships, particularly in the climate areas, to be successful. And it takes all of those elements. You know, I've heard since I was a little child the old saying, it takes a village to be successful. And public-private partnerships is just an extension of the idea that it takes a village. It takes group intelligence. It takes group commitment to pull all these together to be successful. So, Dr. Sharif, I think that's my concluding remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Talib, what's your concluding remarks?
Okay, I thought I did say my concluding remarks, but I will, although I have to leave within 5 minutes, if you don't mind. That my concluding remarks are that in the developing world, the role of government is a very important role, as has been said by Dr. Smith. I think David Smith is very correct in this. And now, the other partners that come in here, what I want to add to what Dr. Smith said, USAID and all these people that work with NGOs here in Jordan, they don't look at them with great trust. The public does not look at them with great trust, because it's seen as if these NGOs and these world bodies like USAID, like EU, like all the others, are trying to impose their values and their way of thinking on us. That's how it's seen by the public, unfortunately. It's unfortunate because that's not always the case. And it's up to us here in the developing country to manage that and to regulate it and to say yes or no. It's up to us, really. We don't do our work very well, but they're doing their job very well. And they are not the people that we can depend on when it comes to climate change. I don't think we can depend much on USAID or on EU funds. That's not the case. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharif. I'm sorry I have to go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. David Schumacher, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, quickly before our other two contributors exit, I appreciated both of your comments this morning. I think there was a lot here. And as always, when I do your show, I love talking about what I think is important to me and what I research. But I also love the input that I get from others, because that makes for a richer conversation. As was pointed out, we're all in this together. It does take a village, and it takes an ever-enlarging village, and it takes a village large enough to solve the problem that we're working on. The city that I live in can't solve a problem for a whole state. A single state cannot solve a problem for a whole nation. We need that village that's sizable for that. And it doesn't mean that all the people in the village get along all the time. Okay?
Yeah.
We will have people with different points of view, but if we can keep open conversation, we can keep rational conversation, and be willing to change our point of view as we obtain new information. It's one of the reasons I like science so much. It's not perfect because sometimes new ideas in science also have to fight through the status quo to be accepted, but it
Yeah.
eventually happens. But we need that type of openness and discussion and being willing to change. And it's no less true with climate change, climate smart. And there's a lot more to talk about in this area, climate smart. I'd like to go into smart cities and smart infrastructure and a number of other things. However, that will have to wait for another day as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is excellent discussion, especially when we discuss about climate smart public-private partnership. It's give us a new view, different point of view, and especially different strategy, which may be helpful for the developing nations, also for the developed nations. Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher, Professor David Smith, and Dr. Talib Rafal for your continuous support for
Thank
World
you.
Talent Economy Forum. And beside that, I request all of our audience, please share our content with your government agency, corporation, and academy. And we are taking a lot of actions. Those who are interested to join in our projects, come, join, and take action. Thank you. Bye-bye, and take
Please
care.
do. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir.